Hey folks, it's Andrew from BTO Range in Conroe, Texas again. Another little installation of our series on pretty cool firearms from days gone by, I guess. And this is an interesting gun. It's not really what we have been doing as far as commercial guns, although they were available commercially. This is a Harrington and Richardson H&R Reising Model 50 submachine gun in 45 ACP. So, interesting story about the designer of this gun, Eugene Reising, who went by Gene Reising. He started out actually working for Colt Firearms sometime around 1909 or slightly before as an assembler putting pistols together, and he rapidly rose into the design realm at Colt and ended up working actually with John Browning on the final design of the Colt 1911 pistol. To the point where during the military trials, Reising actually was a guy shooting the 1911 for the trials when they went against the Savage pistol for the eventual adoption of the Colt 1911. So he had a good career at Colt. Everything was looking good until he decided to shoot a Luger pistol of all things at Camp Perry in 1913, in which Colt gave him the boot, and that was the end of his career with Colt. But he kept doing some design stuff and working as a contract designer and a gunsmith, and he designed his own target pistol, the Reising 22 pistol, which was a competitor to the Colt Woodsman of the time in the 1920s. And he had the Reising Arms Company. The gun was being produced by New Haven Arms and a couple of other people, but it was marketed by Reising. And that continued until about 1925. And 1925, apparently he wasn't doing quite as well business-wise as he should, and he ended up getting involved with some gang activity of all things in New York City, and was actually convicted of a violation of the Sullivan Act for selling silencers, Maxim silencers, to some gang people or gang members in New York. Now, New York had passed the Sullivan Act in 1911. Which predated the National Firearms Act in 1934. So in 1925, when all this happened, you could buy a silencer over the counter, you could order it through the mail, it would just show up at your door, but not in New York City. So he got convicted of this violation of the Sullivan Act and went to prison or jail in New York for 2 years because of that. But in 1927, he got out and he started trying to get his pistol business back up again. It wasn't working very well, so he ended up still designing and working as a gunsmith where he could. And he submitted a design for a submachine gun to Harrington and Richardson, H&R, in 1939, which was this gun. And during the time, war was starting to brew up in Europe quite a bit. And when war kicked off in 1941, as far as the United States was concerned, there just wasn't enough submachine guns to go around. And the Marine Corps was first in, last armed, typically during that time. And they needed a submachine gun. They couldn't get enough Thompson submachine guns, which was the gun of choice, or the submachine gun being used throughout the rest of the military. So some of these Reising guns were bought, and they didn't do very well, to be honest with you. The commercial blued finish on these guns would rust. There were some reliability issues. They didn't quite communicate well to the Marines, and the Marines didn't communicate well amongst themselves, was that parts interchangeability. There's quite a bit of fitted parts in this gun, so you couldn't just dump all the parts in a bucket and then put them in different guns and things like that. So it had a pretty poor showing in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and it was relegated to like rear unit, guard duty, things like that. But where the gun really started to shine was in law enforcement sales during World War II and even post-World War II, because it was relatively inexpensive compared to the Thompson submachine gun. Now also in this time, I didn't bring one with me, we do have one at the range, General Motors of all people started making the M3, commonly called the grease gun submachine gun, which was a stamped sheet metal machine gun that stayed in service in militaries around the world until the 1980s. But this gun really showed up well for law enforcement who didn't have quite as severe conditions to work with. So this is the Model 50. It's an early gun. It's got the 28 fin barrel. Later guns had fewer fins, a 12 fin barrel. It does have the compensator on the end. It's not a cuts compensator, but it's similar. This gun fires from a closed bolt, which is different from the majority of submachine guns of the time, the first generation submachine guns, which all fire from an open bolt. So this was kind of advertised by Reising as the ability to be more accurate in single shot or semi-auto fire. And that's true, it was. It does have a very reasonable rate of fire, around 500 rounds a minute, which is fairly slow when you compare it to most 9mm submachine guns, but it makes the gun fairly controllable. Now, some collectors will indicate that there is a commercial model Reising and a military model Reising, but H&R never differentiated between the two. There was never any contract with different specifications. The later guns were all parkerized instead of blued. That may be where a lot of it comes from. Some people indicate the number of fins, sling swivel placement on the guns also differentiate for some collectors the difference between the commercial and military guns, and also whether there's 2 rivets here, 3 rivets. I mean, it gets a little in the weeds. But this is an early commercial gun, if you will. There's no provision for sling swivels on this gun. We have test fired it at the range. Now, when these guns were sold to police departments, a company called Federal Laboratories was the primary distributor. And the guns would have come in a big green case like this. Actually, this is a big green case. Would have had a decal on top. Typically, this decal is missing. The decal itself adds about $200 to the value of this set. This case, somewhere around $700 to $900 just for the case in conjunction with the rifle. So you see it's a fitted case. It's got this nice blue flocking material in it. And the magazines that we have are original magazines. They're correctly marked. So we have 4 of those 12-round magazines for the gun. That was the typical magazine capacity of that Reising, which was another issue for the military. Is you have to change a lot of mags if you're in a firefight in the military running 12-round mags. So this is what the Model 50 Reising would have looked like if bought by a police department or a prison unit or something along those lines during the 1940s and 1950s. Now bear in mind, 1934 National Firearms Act was passed, the first national gun legislation, and required registration of machine guns. So these would have been registered when they were built. They were transferable. There was no such thing as a non-transferable machine gun at that time. That didn't happen until 1986. So you could buy one as an individual, as a citizen, or as a police department or guard unit, or whoever felt the need for an automatic weapon could actually buy one. They're not necessarily more expensive, although that registration tax imposed by NFA of 34 was still $200 even back then. And $200 in 1940 is way different than $200 in 2023 for sure. So interesting little gun, the Model 50. There were some variations of this gun designed or for the purposes of some military usage. There were some units that wanted a shorter version, one that was more compact. So Reising and Harrington Richardson came out with the Model 55. And the Model 55 is basically the same barreled action, shorter barrel with a folding stock. Very difficult gun to get a hold of, except for right now. So this is an H&R Model 55. This is a later gun. You see we have a much shorter barrel. We have a 12-fin unit here. And we have this folding stock. Now the folding stock is no great shucks. It just has a spring clip here and a double spring clip back here that holds the stock in the extended position. And one of the significant complaints about this gun was during extended firing, this stock could actually collapse and swing in because it's only held in place by these two spring steel clips. So otherwise, it's basically the same action, same bolt, same everything. The earlier guns, I mean, the barrel or the top legend here on the later guns is viewable from the left side or readable from the left side. The earlier guns readable from the right side. So a little bit different gun. This one's harder to get. As you can see, there's a huge condition difference between these two guns. So if you're looking at getting into National Firearms Act stuff, machine guns are transferable machine guns are exceptionally collectible. There's only around 175,000 transferable machine guns currently on the registry, and it's doubtful there'll ever be any more. It would require Congress to allow that to happen, and that's extremely doubtful. So as attrition occurs and as guns deteriorate or they break and they can't be fixed or they're destroyed or something happens to them, that number is going to go down before it goes up, certainly. So supply and demand would seem to indicate that the money will go up. The Reisings represent one of the more affordable entries into the National Firearms Act collecting or machine gun collecting. You can get this set would typically run in the low $10,000 to $12,000 range typically, depending on where you buy and how you buy. I really haven't seen any comparables on the 55, so I'd have to look and see what those guns are running for. But today, even a Mac 11 from the 90s or from the 80s would run $7,000, $8,000, maybe even $10,000. So, as opposed to in the 1980s, they were selling for $3,500 maybe. So, the NFA stuff actually appreciates better than at least my stock market portfolio has been doing. So, they're good investments if you can get them. And if you have the ability to start collecting those, it's worth doing. We sell them. We deal in that at the range. We are a Class 3 dealer, I guess, if that's the way you want to put it. And we will be doing another video, not part of this series, about the NFA process and the means of going through that registration and what's required from a federal standpoint to make that occur. But it's the same for silencers or short barrel rifles or machine guns. The process is exactly the same, and the money is exactly the same as far as the tax goes. So it's worth doing. Anyway, that's the Reising Model 50 submachine gun and the Model 55 submachine gun. Interesting story on the maker. It's interesting that the guy went to prison for 2 years. Didn't stop him a bit from being in the gun business when he got out, but I mean, things were different. Also remember back in the 40s, a man named David Williams actually made some prototypes of what became the M1 carbine in the prison workshop where he was incarcerated for murder. So that's a different story. We may pull a carbine out at some point and do something on him. It's been done a billion times. We may do it again anyway, but anyway, the Reising submachine gun, a little bit about Eugene Reising. Pretty unique individual, and his designs actually stayed with Harrington and Richardson for years afterwards. A lot of their 22 semi-automatic rifles carried on the basics of the Reising design all the way into the 70s. So he was probably the most important firearms designer for the Harrington and Richardson Arms Company, at least in the modern era. So if you like what we're doing here, guys, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're going to try to keep bringing you this content every week. A lot of it's dependent upon what stuff we can get our hands on at the range, or I can dive into my personal collection. God knows what we'll come up with there, but we'll see. And anyway, appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot.